This is a piece of racing history here in Daytona Beach. The last part of famed NASCAR mechanic Smokey Yunick's garage was gutted by fire tonight and is being called suspicious.
$5 for a fender hammer, $20 for a box of used race car parts. That was the going rate the morning Smokey Yunick's garage finally opened on North Beach Street in Daytona Beach, 9 months after they buried him, with a queue outside made of people who had driven from Maine and flown in from Oregon for a stack of hubcaps.
Well, this guy was so innovative and such a genius, he said the quote, "Other people race against competitors, I race against forces of nature and gravity."
Racing had spent 40 years arguing about what was locked inside that building. Nobody guessed it would be sold off a table, and nobody could explain the one thing in that room priced at $20,000. Why was it sitting in a junkyard instead of a factory? The sale. Nobody expected. Smokey Yunick died on May 9th, 2001. Leukemia. He was 77. For decades, the building at 957 North Beach Street had been the most rumored address in American motorsport. He opened it in 1947. He spent 40 years turning it into an argument the sport could not settle, and he painted the words on the wall himself, "The best damn garage in town." In 1987, he closed it. His explanation was one line long. There weren't any good mechanics left. He was 63, still working, and simply stopped taking outside jobs. The building sat largely untouched after that. It was still sitting when he died, and the stories about what was inside had 14 more years to grow. Confiscated engines. Blueprints Detroit had paid to bury. A vault. None of that was true, and the way the family disproved it was the last thing anyone expected. The engine with the impossible numbers. The sale listing advertised 80 miles per gallon. In a room where most things cost $5, that claim is why serious people came through the door. The program behind it was something Smokey called the hot vapor cycle. The best documented example started life as a 2.5-liter Pontiac Fiero Iron Duke 4-cylinder. Stock. That engine made around 90 horsepower and returned roughly 35 miles per gallon on the highway. Smokey's carbureted version made 250 horsepower and 250 pound-feet of torque, 0 to 60 in about 6.5 seconds, 51 miles per gallon on 93-octane pump gas. The principle is adiabatic combustion. The plain version is this. Every engineer in the industry was cooling the intake charge. Smokey heated it. Heat was the enemy everyone else was engineering around. He treated it as the fuel supply's last processing step. He used waste heat from the exhaust and the coolant to boil the fuel and air mixture before it reached the cylinder. The charge went through an exhaust-driven turbine he called a homogenizer, mounted under the carburetor, then through a wrapped manifold until it passed 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Fully vaporized fuel let the engine run absurdly lean, an air-to-fuel ratio beyond 20-to-1. Detroit labs and original equipment engineers tested it. Not Smokey's dyno. Theirs. The numbers held. The engine met strict 1980s emissions standards with no computer controlling anything. The idea went back to the 1950s and to Ralph Johnson, a Holley carburetor specialist and General Motors dyno technician who worked alongside Smokey for years. Together they learned to push past the normal detonation threshold, running exhaust temperatures near 2,250 degrees to manage the burn. Johnson described the calibration in words no engineering paper would print. The car never ran as well as it did just before it let go. They built more than one, and not as showpieces. A 3-cylinder Buick, a Ford, a Dodge Omni. Each test car cleared 45 miles per gallon and produced close to 2 horsepower per cubic inch. These were cars that got driven on public roads by a man in his 60s who had already been told by every institution in the industry that the numbers were impossible. Production came close twice. An S10 truck project, a licensing arrangement with crane cams. Both collapsed, and neither collapsed over performance. Nobody ever produced a technical refutation. The dyno sheets held. The emissions figures held. The objections were commercial. Warranty exposure on an engine running hotter and leaner than any service department had seen. Tooling costs on an assembly no plant was set up to build. And a quiet institutional preference for ideas that arrived with a corporate logo already attached. Not invented here. The prototypes did not collapse. They were still sitting in the garage when he died. The paper trail Detroit couldn't dismiss. An engine in a garage proves nothing on its own. Dated filings do. United States Patent and Trademark Office records confirm Smokey secured at least 9 patents between 1978 and 1996. That is the part of the story nobody can argue into a barstool legend, because a patent is legal proof of when an idea existed. The hot vapor research produced a cluster of filings between 1984 and 1988, covering the apparatus, the operating method, and the fuel conditioning system for internal combustion engines, the exact technology in the Fiero. Those patents entered the public domain around 2003. Anyone can read them today. Alongside them sit patent 4,068,635 for a pressure vent in 1978, patent 5,246,086 for an oil change system in 1991, and patent 5,515,712 for engine testing methods in 1994. His hardest fights were never about horsepower. In 1961, he built pneumatic air jacks that could lift a stock car instantly in the pits. NASCAR rejected them as inappropriate for the series. The following year, he mounted an enormous wing over the engine of Jim Rathman's Siemens Vista Special Watson Roadster for the Indianapolis 500. It generated downforce nobody had seen and cornering speed to match. It also dragged badly on the straights, and the United States Auto Club banned it anyway. Wings later became mandatory equipment in Can-Am, Formula One, and IndyCar. The delay that cost the most was the wall. In the early 1980s, long before the safer barrier existed, Smokey designed a crude soft wall concept. Old tires sandwiched between heavy plywood sheets to absorb an impact. NASCAR did not adopt it. Drivers kept hitting bare concrete. He formalized the research anyway and filed patent 5,645,368 in 1996 for a racetrack with a novel crash barrier. The Chevelle and the myth the tape measure killed. The photograph still circulates. Smokey beside a Chevelle, cigar clamped, grin crooked, captioned as the 7/8 scale car that made NASCAR rewrite the rulebook. The scale model part is the one piece of the legend the measurements destroy. A genuine 7/8 car would have been nearly 10 inches narrower, more than 2 feet shorter, and riding on a 100-inch wheelbase. Anybody walking through the garage would have spotted it instantly. What actually existed were 3 1966-bodied Chevelles, usually miscalled 1967 models, built on developmental work from Chevrolet Engineering, and then finished by Smokey with a patience nobody else was spending. The real modifications were aerodynamic, and they were subtle. He moved the body roughly 2 inches rearward on the chassis to shift weight distribution. He smoothed and raised the floor pan to control airflow underneath. He lowered the roof and windows slightly and laid the windshield back. He reworked the fenders and the drip rails. He sectioned the front bumper and made it taller so it worked as a spoiler. Every one of those changes was individually defensible. Stacked together, they made a car that slipped through air. The rest of the field was fighting. The sheet metal stayed largely stock. The geometry did not. Above 180 miles per hour, changes measured in fractions of an inch are worth tenths of a second a lap. When inspectors realized something was off, they tried to build their first templates using a wrecked Chevelle driven by Bobby Johns as the pattern. The process was a mess. It ended with NASCAR mandating standardized roof, hood, and trunk templates for the entire field. The engineering worked, and the timing sheets proved it before the inspectors could. Driving one of those Chevelles, Curtis Turner became the first man to qualify above 180 miles per hour at Daytona. Smokey denied the scale model rumor directly in a 1987 Circle Track article, and again in his autobiography. The alterations, he insisted, were far more calculated than shrinking a car, which fits the pattern. He once exploited fuel capacity limits by running 11 feet of 2-inch tubing as a fuel line, adding roughly 5 gallons to the car's total volume without touching the tank. There are endless stories of offset chassis and cars driving away from inspection on an empty tank. His own defense was blunt. He believed the other guys were cheating 10 times worse, so it was self-defense. That defense makes more sense once you know what happened in 1964. 1,100 pages in his own voice. The most personal thing in that building was not a car or an engine, it was a manuscript. Smokey finished his autobiography as the leukemia closed in. Roughly 1,100 pages, titled Best Damn Garage in Town, released posthumously around 2001 as a 3-volume boxed set through Carbon Press and his family. More than 400 photographs, volumes covering his life, his stock car years, and his Indianapolis entries and inventions. John DeLorean narrated the audiobook. It is the raw source that replaces every invented deathbed letter circulating online, and it was finished by a man who knew he was running out of time to finish it. And the section that matters most is 1964. That May, his close friend Fireball Roberts crashed at Charlotte. The car caught fire. Roberts was pulled out alive and burned over most of his body, and he did not die at the track. He died 40 days later. 40 days is a long time to think about a fuel tank. Smokey came out of those 40 days convinced the sport was killing people over a solvable problem. Smokey came out of it a different competitor. He pushed hard for safer fuel cells, containment that would not rupture and spray on impact, and he pushed them at a sanctioning body run by one man. NASCAR founder Bill France Sr. overruled him, not once, repeatedly. The proposals went nowhere. The cars kept running the same tanks, and the man who could out-argue any inspector in the garage could not move the one office that mattered. He stopped trying. Smokey left the organization around 1970. The man the sport remembers for gray area fuel lines was the same man it refused to listen to about fire. The book also handles the part of his record that does not survive checking. Smokey claimed more than 50 missions in a B-17. National Archives records show he was drafted in 1943 as a welder and served on active duty from 1944 to 1946. The military did verify he reached the rank of second lieutenant and earned an air medal with the 15th Air Force. A decorated record, just not the one he told. The racing record needs no such caveat: 57 Cup Series wins, 2 championships as owner and crew chief, the 1960 Indianapolis 500 as chief mechanic, the first owner to win 2 Daytona 500s in 1961 and 1962, more than 30 Halls of Fame, including the inaugural class of the International Motorsports Hall of Fame in 1990 and the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America in 2000, all of which was already written down. The thing that surprised everyone was still in the garage: what survived and what it accuses. The property sold in 2003 as the estate plan intended. Most of the buildings came down carefully. The last structure burned on April 25, 2011, around 7 in the evening, in a fire reported as suspicious. Nothing that mattered was inside. Tony Allers, an enthusiast who acquired the running hot vapor examples, built a restored, daily driven Fiero around the salvaged original drivetrain and drove it for years. On Christmas 2009, he donated it to the Don Garlitz Museum of Drag Racing, where it remains on display. Trish Yunick Brown still holds 4 prototype engines. A collector owns the hot vapor Dodge with a signed bill of sale. Allers kept original garage tools and one of the shop doors. Another prototype is reported to be on long-term loan to the Smithsonian. Rank that inventory and one item stands alone: not the typewriter, not the GMC sign, not the 1,100-page book. It was the hot vapor hardware, a carbureted 2.5-liter 4-cylinder making 250 horsepower and 51 miles per gallon in the 1980s, verified by outside engineers, meeting emissions with no computer, and refused by an industry that could not stomach an idea it had not authored. It is the only item on the list that still functions as an accusation. Everything else he left behind eventually won. Every standardized body template in modern NASCAR descends from a Chevelle shifted 2 inches on its chassis. The wings and pneumatic jacks he was refused are mandatory now in other series. The plywood and tire wall nobody wanted laid the groundwork for barriers keeping drivers alive today. The industry came around on all of it, decades late. It never came around on the engine. The patent sat in the public domain. The prototype sat in a garage in Daytona Beach while the country argued about fuel economy. And in February 2002, the answer went up for sale. A working answer nobody wanted, priced at $20,000, next to a box of hubcaps. If you want more racing history built on receipts, patent numbers, sale records, verified figures, subscribe, because there is a lot more of it. And tell me in the comments, of everything Smokey Yunick left unfinished, which piece do you most wish the industry had actually finished?